Want to advertise your business in a cost-effective way? It's time to give podcast advertising a try. Research shows a high rate of podcast listeners made a purchase as a result of an ad they heard on a podcast. Visit podbean.com/brands to launch a cost-effective podcast advertising campaign in minutes. That's podbean.com/brands.
Hello and welcome to episode 86 of the world's first Paul Weller fan podcast. I'm Dan Jennings, and 10 years ago I gave up my live streaming career as a radio presenter with one big regret: never getting to interview my hero, the legendary British musician Paul Weller. This podcast exists purely to solve that issue. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Paul. And in this episode, a real treat as my latest guest, the legendary booking agent Martin Hopewell, a man who was a key part of the Weller setup for 28 years, from the Jam in 1977 to the Style Council to Paul Weller Solo, right through to Studio 150. From smaller boutique agency Cowbell through to World Service, which became part of the mega super agency Primary Talent. They're the people who look after huge artists like Rod Stewart, Brian Ferry, Culture Club, Kylie, along with The Cure and Peter Gabriel, who he still works with to this day. Over the next hour, you're going to hear some amazing stories, from the chaos of a punk festival in Paris to life on the road with gigs around the UK and Europe to Japan and Australia, and a massive appreciation of Paul's incredible work ethic, something that keeps coming up on this podcast time and time again. We'll also hear about huge love and appreciation for the Weller family and special memories of John, Paul's dad, and of course manager. Let's get into it. Martin Hopewell, thanks for joining me.
Hello, Dan. That's perfectly all right.
I'm really looking forward to chatting with you on this, because I think it was 28 years as part of the Weller crew. Would that be right, working with those guys?
Yeah, it was 28. I think it was 28 years. It would have been nice to have made it to 30, like nice round numbers. Yeah, 28 saw me through the Jam from the very beginning, right through to Paul at his peak doing his solo stuff, with the meat in the sandwich being the Style Council, which was fantastic fun. Listen, it was all great fun. Most of the stuff that I remember with great affection about working with the Weller family is completely unrepeatable. So it kind of with very little to say apart from the really boring stuff, most of which I've forgotten anyway. Good stuff. But anyway, you ask the questions and I'll tell you what I can. Listen, if I ever wrote what would otherwise be the most boring book in the world, which would be my autobiography, which will never happen, and I think probably 12 out of 13 chapters would be adventures with the Weller family. And a lot of them are just things that you can't repeat. I don't know how litigious Paul would be nowadays, but he'd probably love it. But it's probably best to err on the side of caution. But we had a lot of adventures and did a lot of stuff. I'm really proud of the stuff that we did, because a lot of it was, at a time where a lot of the stuff that exists now didn't exist. So the big arenas that people now see big bands in weren't there, particularly in the days of the Jam. As it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, we were having to go off and scout around the countryside trying to find equestrian centres or, ice rinks, whatever, that you could actually board over and do a gig in. So it was all pretty exciting stuff,
Yeah, it's true. I hadn't thought of that, because now it's like, you're a Google search away from being able to check out the venue, whereas these places, a lot of them weren't music venues. You're having to think about, okay, could that work? Let me go and then actually do a recce and a visit, right?
Well, yeah, it was that. When we started out, listen, you're talking 45 years ago, which is probably twice as old as most of the people listening to this thing. And, my memory ain't that great. And I've never been a particularly good historian. Don't ask me for any gigographies or anything, so I haven't got a clue. But it's very different when we kicked off in the late 70s, in 77. You were pretty well looking at playing the UK, playing in Europe was exotic lands, there be dragons, and we didn't know quite what to do with them or who was there or what have you. So in the UK, you were looking at clubs and you were looking at college gigs. And then you had a network of private promoters who would, for example, in my neck of the woods now, there was a chap called Barry Clark. He used to promote at St Albans City Hall and Dunstable Queensway and Watford whatever it was, I can't think. And in Nottingham, there'd be somebody else. And so you'd play the gigs where there was some Herbert who was silly enough to put his money down to book a rock band, And if that ended up being Cromer, I mean, why Cromer? We played a lot of gigs in Cromer. Why was that? Because there was a chap there called Frank Boswell who wanted to book us,
Right.
So we do that.
That's brilliant. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, so you're heading up to Norfolk for that. That's hilarious. Right, now we have to kick us off, really. We should understand when you first got into this malarkey. Was it 1972 when you first became an agent? Was that right?
Oh, God. Yeah. I'd been at Reading University, did some events there, then got offered a job working for the Noel Gay organisation, whose star attractions were Dorothy Squires, Jake Thackeray, and people who've now disappeared from knowledge. Apart from John Cleese, he was there as well. And they wanted us to, me and another chap, to start up a rock department. And that lasted for 6 whole months before they sacked us. And but we weren't the first. Before that, there was a chap called David Enthoven and another chap called Johnny Gaydon, who ended up being EG Management, Enthoven Gaydon, who were managing Roxy Music and T-Rex, and they were at the time like the hottest kids on the block. And they lasted about 6 months as well. So that's fair enough, And
how did you get the gig then with Cowbell? So Cowbell, the ones that the Jam eventually signed with.
I mean, just to briefly say, after I got summarily dismissed as being a useless little oik from the Noel Gay organisation, then eventually I got offered a job at Chrysalis, working in the agency that was run by Kenny Bell and Richard Cowley. For anybody who's interested in agency history, which is about one person probably, and that's me, along with another guy called John Jackson, who went off to make a fortune as a heavy metal agent and doing Metallica and AC/DC and stuff like that. So we were actually Chrysalis for a while. I think you're right. I think when I bumped into the Jam, we were already Cowbell. The most appalling name in the history of music business names, that was my fault. I'd pointed out that if Chris Wright and Terry Ellis could be Chris Ellis, then if Cowley and Bell ever formed a company, I was joking, it would have to be called Cowbell. They took it seriously, and we ended up with that name and this stupid fucking logo of a cow with a bell hanging around its neck and a pair of headphones on, looking very stoned, peering over a hedge. And somehow we managed to make a decent agency with that image.
Well, some really big signings. I mean, you talked about rock like Jethro Tull, Procol Harum, Rod Stewart, Brian Ferry, the Sex Pistols, Culture Club.
I mean, it was different then. Agency was more boutique than it is now. Now, sadly, the Americans have moved in and gobbled up the entire international business, including the UK one. And you've got these mega agencies with, 500 acts on the list. But, at the time, if you looked at our roster, it would be about, 30, 40, 50 acts maybe. And that was it.
The Jam signed in 77. And what was your job? What was it that you had to do for them? What do they come to you for?
Well, I should tell you, shouldn't I tell you how I bumped into the Jam?
Oh, please do. Yeah, go on.
That was quite good. You've interviewed Chris Parry.
Yeah.
So Chris was, at the time, he was like a sort of junior A&R man, and he'll deny that, but I think he was, and I was like a junior-ish agent, And so we sort of teamed up and gave each other tips and stuff like this. And then when the whole punk thing happened, which none of us, anybody who ever says that they knew it was going to be big is probably telling porcupines, because all of us thought it was a bit nutty, but it was working. So the whole business was flying around, walking down Wardour Street, bumping into a punk, can you play anything? Yeah, well, okay, I'll sign you up. Chris had formed, I don't know if you mentioned this, but he'd formed a publishing company with a chap called Brian Morrison. Brian was a great character as well, and he deserves a little part in this story. He was like an East End boy, cigar chewing, already a millionaire. He went on later to sign Wham for like nothing and made even more money, but an adorable character known as Uncle Murray. And outside of Chris's stuff with Polydor, they'd formed a publishing company called And Son Limited. And I think that's where it came in, because I got a call from Chris and from Brian saying, we've found this band. You've got to come see them at the Red Cow in Hammersmith. Now, given that I was a bit of a little tosser back in the day and a bit full of myself, I dutifully turned up at the Red Cow in Hammersmith and found about 60 in the audience, bouncing up and down, and these 3 guys on the stage with suits that looked as if they'd been bought when they were like 5 years earlier, because it didn't quite fit, also bouncing up and down. And to the strains of the theme tune to Batman. And I thought, no, come on, you're having a laugh. I mean, this is just silly. Again, a lot of people would say, oh, yes, I saw them and it was like this blinding light and I knew that they were going to be immense. I didn't. They took me off to, Chris and Brian took me off to a local hamburger joint and bought me a hamburger and persuaded me to start getting them a few gigs. A couple of months later, after it had all suddenly taken off in the press, I was pursuing John and the three lads around the Royal College of Art, frantically trying to hand out contracts for them all to sign, which I still have somewhere, and that was that. So that's how I got into it, or stumbled into it anyway.
Brilliant. And their first gig was a French punk festival, I understand. With that with working with you, is that right?
The first gigs, we were booking them in colleges and clubs. As many gigs as they could possibly fit in. Sometimes we'd double up and we'd do one show in London, for example, early evening, then race off to University of London Union or something and do a late night gig or something. They worked like troopers. Unbelievable. Just work. Do you want to talk about the Mont-de-Marsan Festival du Punk?
Yes, let's. So this is them, the Stranglers and the Damned on the bill, right?
And me, which was a huge mistake.
It starts with a food fight, is that right?
Well, there were many food fights, but anybody listening, if they ever fancy doing the sort of job that I've been doing for the last 50 years, don't ever go on a trip with a band who are on a jet that's been chartered for a whole load of punk bands and everyone's traveling together. I mean, it's just a huge mistake. So I turn up with my nice little neat jacket and my briefcase and my neatly pressed jeans and everything else at the airport. And as you say, you had that load of Herberts all piled onto this charter jet, which I think about 2 minutes after the wheels had gone back up again, somebody was pissed and wanted to fly the plane and was insistent on flying the plane, And then when, of course, they hand the food out, then, of course, it's just all over the walls and all over everybody. And I'm just sitting in my little chair, ducking, trying to stay out the way, The Jam were very well behaved, by the way. It was, of course, it was the others. No, they were. Briefly, you get to the other end, and of course, then there's a coach, which is going to take all the bands all together on one coach. Again, a huge mistake, to this little tiny sleepy French village called Mont-de-Marsan. And again, I'm sitting there with my briefcase and my jacket, trying to keeping as low a profile as possible. I see this liquid trickling down between my legs from the front of the bus, and someone's had a slash further up the bus, of course, And then I'm sitting there and Rat Scabies turns up, the drummer with the Damned, yeah? And he says to the boys in the Jam, well, who's this geezer? And they very politely said, well, he's our agent. He said, I'm going to bite his fucking leg. And the next thing I know, this guy, and if you've ever seen his teeth, it's not a pretty sight. It's sunk into my thigh and stayed there. So you kind of start laughing, and then you're thinking, well, now what do? I've got this drummer's teeth sunk in my thigh. I mean,
well, he didn't move. He's just there.
He didn't move. He was there for minutes. We arrive in this little tiny village, and like a lot of little French villages, you've got the cold streets and the old medieval buildings and stuff, and then you've got the tiny little square. It wasn't a square; it was round, but you know what I mean, with a fountain in the middle. The Jam were the last ones to be dropped off, and that's where the hotel was. So, of course, by that time, they had perhaps a little bit too much to drink and headed straight into the fountain, like fully dressed, just straight into the fountain. Probably about a minute later, you hear the police sirens coming. About 2 minutes after that, the lads have been packed into the back of one of those French police vans with the corrugated iron sides, the ones, and roars off down the road with John Weller and me chasing after them, running after them to the local gendarmerie, where I had to then drag out my schoolboy French to say, pardon, monsieur, ils sont désolés, and all this stuff, explain who they were. Meanwhile, they're sitting there looking like three little drowned rats in the police station. I think Rick Buckler had dyed his hair black and all the black dye was running down his face. I mean, it was a sorry sight. Of course, as the history books now tell, they didn't actually end up playing it. Somebody had decided to change the running order. John didn't like that. And I was packed off to tell the promoter, not only were we not going to play, but that we wanted all of our money in cash. And of course, the promoter back in those days, I think he went on to run Virgin Records in France or something, but at the time, it was pretty scary stuff. It was all flick knives, and this guy sitting behind his desk with a bunch of heavies behind him, and me, I'm only in my early 20s or something, going, oh, excuse me, can we have our money, please? But we're not paying. That was my experience of the Mont de Marsan Festival.
Brilliant. I feel like that deserves a round of applause. Did you get paid?
Oh, yeah, we got it. Yeah, I couldn't believe it. Maybe they took pity on me, or I was too little to beat up or something, but we got it. But I did see the band soundcheck there, and I do have a photograph somewhere of them on stage at Mont de Marsan, and the soundcheck was good. Nobody ever saw the rest of it, you know.
Oh, my God, that's hilarious. Now, we should talk about the band breaking the USA, or not, as the case may be, because there's a lot said about how Paul wasn't really interested in the US, didn't really like being there certainly in the jam days, and then famously flying home for when going underground, got to number one so they could be on top of the pops and stuff. What was your experience of trying to get them into the US and breaking the US?
Well, very little, because the way it works in the agency world, or at least it certainly did then, is that with a band that was based in Europe, or let's say in the UK then, to be honest, they would have a UK agent who would book all of the world apart from the USA and Canada. And that was always historically be the job of an American agent. I think, pointed John and Paul at a chap called Wayne Forte, who's a lovely bloke and is still going, and he was booking them back in those days. All that I got to experience of it was just what you've said, that they really didn't like it. I don't think the Americans ever really got the jam. Their idea of, I hate to use the word punk, but their idea of punk was not our idea of punk. Our idea of punk was something far harder edged than just sticking some makeup on and prancing around on the stage with long hair and tight trousers. That's probably unfair of me to say that, but you know what I mean. I think it's probably also fair to say that certainly throughout the Jam's career, there was always this lingering thing from critics that it was too English. You know, that didn't stop the band from doing really well in a lot of places that weren't English, but I think that was probably the problem with America. I'm not one to comment on who Paul Weller is, although I kind of have my own view of it. But American society is not Paul Weller. That's not what I think he's about. And it was never about, we've got to break America to get big or anything. Paul wasn't bothered about that sort of stuff, you know.
There's a bit in Rick Buckler's autobiography where he talks about your side of things being a well-oiled machine. So everything running through you is a well-oiled machine.
Well-oiled is possibly the case, although...
Well, that's maybe what he meant. No, he was talking about it being really well organised. Because I think, when the jam finished and he was doing other things, he realised, I guess they'd taken it for granted a little bit. And he realised how slick it was, that operation,
I'm sorry to hear him say that, because I carried on booking Rick's band as well after the jam stood up. So
I've stitched him right up there.
I have words about that, yeah.
It's really interesting, actually, when I think about it. The length of time, really, that the Jam were producing records for, so 77 to 82, is pretty much the length of time it takes Adele to release an album. But they've left such an amazing legacy, and so many fans talk about their music and what it means to them to this day. What did it mean to you being part of the Jam mix? Because we'll talk about the Style Council and Weller solo in a sec, but what did it mean to you being part of that mix?
Yeah, I mean, it was, it's probably the time that I will remember the clearest. It was very vivid. It was the work ethic. When you talk about Paul Weller, certainly through my experience of working with him, it's the work ethic. Paul didn't want to piss about. It was just work. You go in, like you clock in, you do your time, and you probably don't clock out till late. But I mean, just work, work, work. I mean, the sheer volume of shows that the Jam did was just phenomenal. And then when we ran out of places that were big enough to play in one night, we'd play 2 nights there, in these weird Birmingham Bingley halls and D-side leisure centres and that equestrian centre in Braintree and all these funny places, and Cromer, of course. And then when it wasn't touring season, when it was touring would be in the spring and in the autumn normally. So then, of course, they'd want to do the seaside tours, which again were bloody hilarious. I mean, half of the places we played, Wigan Pier sounded like a seaside resort. And we all know that Wigan is quite a long way away from the sea, right? Swindon Oasis, which sounded kind of like seasidey, but I wrote into a contract there just to see if anyone was paying any attention to all the verbiage I was putting into contracts, saying very officially essentially it was agreed and understood that the promoter will arrange for all of the taps in the venue to be turned on at least 48 hours prior to the performance, and 27 tons of sharp sand deposited in front of the venue to create a seaside atmosphere. Nobody even questioned it. They didn't do it, of course, but they didn't. Nobody called me and went, "Boy, what's this?"
But you're right. I mean, they didn't stop, and I mean, those gigs always had like nice, catchy titles in terms of the types of tour it was as well, didn't it?
Oh yeah, bucket and spade tour and all that sort of stuff. I mean, wonderful characters involved in this whole thing. You've got, it's not just Paul and Rick and Bruce and John and Anne and Nikki and Kenny and all of that crowd. But you also had people like Tony Gibney, Mono. It was deaf in one ear, so he was known as Mono, right? Makes sense, doesn't it? And you had the wonderful Joe Iwome, who was I think he was Commonwealth gold heavyweight boxer. Yeah, John was quite keen on recruiting people by the pound, so you had rather large people. And lovely and all really funny,
Somebody else remarks on the fact that it was a very hairy crew. There was a big hairy crew was how somebody called it, I think, at one point on the podcast.
Yeah, I suppose there was a fair amount. You had Dave Little and with the hair and the beard, not at all what you'd expect, but yes, no. And also the other thing with the Jam was the live shows, man. I mean, they were just electric to be at, I mean, I'd always be somewhere safe, hiding under a staircase or something like that. Just to see the way the audience reacted and the sheer energy that was generated in a room, it was just phenomenal.
And so many people talk about that. So when the split came, was it a surprise for you? And what was your reaction, both in terms of somebody who's in the mix, but also somebody who's earning money from this, booking people,
Shock and horror, really. I mean, I think it's well known that it was at the peak of the Jam's success. And suddenly I found out that this was going to be the last tour we were doing, which ended at Brighton Conference Centre, which was a weird night. I went down for it. My memory of that, I don't remember much about the gig. I remember trying to get in because the whole venue was surrounded by fans, at all the entrances trying to get in. I was right at the back being polite. Suddenly this great big hand seemed to reach over the heads of all the people and pick me up, felt like by the neck and lift me over a bridge. It was Joe Iwome. It just picked me up and literally pulled me off the ground and carried me into the venue. And then the only thing I remember was straight after the gig, seeing the band come off stage and going back. And then we were on this staircase and I think it was the expressions on the three of their faces was just like, that's it then, I mean, it was sad, because we had no idea what was going to happen next. It wasn't like, oh, well, of course, then there'll be the Style Council, which will be a huge success. As far as we were concerned, that was the end of it, And to be honest, nobody, myself included, knew whether it would be Paul or Rick or Bruce who managed to do anything else afterwards. We didn't know that. And in fact, a lot of the money was on Bruce, because he's the good-looking one, and he had that single called Freak that came out and everything. So, yeah, I mean, I was actually booking dates for him and for Rick with Time UK, even if Rick didn't think it was as well-oiled as the Jam, but there you go. What can you do? It's a bit smaller. And with Paul.
And the Style Council comes around pretty quickly, and when it does, straight away Paul's off to Europe and you're booking dates over there.
I mean, I've been looking, knowing I had to do this and having a zero memory of exactly what we did, and it looks like we did that. But I think generally the thing with the Style Council, which by the way was almost called the Torch Society.
I don't know how close it came to being one or the other, though. I'm not sure.
It was one or the other. I know that we started it very cautiously because nobody was making any sort of expectations that, Paul Weller with the Style Council would be instantly as big as the Jam or anything. And we thought the opposite would be true, so we better start really carefully, do some trial gigs out of the way, and whatever we did in the UK, we would err on the small side and build it up again. But, a bit like the Jam, I mean, the Jam went from Red Cow to playing the biggest venues that then existed in the UK inside a couple of years. And the same thing, happened with the Style Council. It became pretty clear what was going to happen. I mean, it was a funny thing because it wasn't I think some people might see it as being this massive transition from the style of the Jam, because you think about the early days of the Jam, very raw, very punk, lots of gobbing and bouncing up and down and stuff. And then you think of the Style Council with the white trousers and the jumpers over the shoulders and everything else. And it wasn't really like that, because at the end of the Jam, already, brass sections were coming in and stuff like that. And so moving on to the Style Council was, it was obviously a shift, but it wasn't as massive a gulf between the two as I think people would imagine,
And even the look of it, Paul was already wearing the Fred Perry and things like that. They'd moved away from those suits that didn't fit these sorts of...
Yeah, well, thank God, yeah, the suits that didn't. No, I came to like those suits eventually. I got it. I did get it eventually. It was just, well, obviously I did, but, it was a question of starting all over again with the Style Council.
But within a couple of years, you're playing Wembley Arena and doing, 3 nights in a row at Wembley Arena. So it moves to those bigger venues quite quickly then.
Yeah, I really like the Style Council. I love the music. Again, a lovely crowd of people, different crowd of people, but it's easy to, with people like Mick Talbot, who's like a real diamond, and Stevie White, who's still a chum, and we still stay in touch, He's a lovely bloke. All of them, Jay and Helen and DC Lee and all that sort of crowd. And it was, and what's his name? God. Used to be called the FA Cup because of his ears stuck out. He played the bongos. But
Steve? The other Steve, is that?
Yes, the other Steve. Yes, you're right. Yeah. If you just have a drummer called Steve, it makes it easier,
Yeah.
Lovely, lovely crowd of people. And again, we had a lot of adventures.
There's one I have to ask you about, because this was in Dennis Monday's autobiography. I don't know if you remember this. This was Amsterdam, and you stayed at the Akura Hotel. Does this ring any bells?
Not, but carry on. Tell me what happened.
So the bar closes, and you, for some reason, invite everyone back to your room when the bar closes.
Oh shit! Yes, I remember. Oh, talk about being naive.
Pick up the story, go on.
Well, this is the agent trying to be sort of, hey, I'm here and what have you, because you're a complete hanger-on. I mean, all the stuff that the agent does is done like months beforehand. By the time the gig comes around, you're just a spare part hanging around backstage with a laminate around your neck trying to look important because there's nothing for you to do, So I thought, hey, I'll just invite everybody back to my place for a drink, And they cleaned out the minibar. I mean, completely. It left me with a bill of like, now it would be thousands, Yes. So thanks for the memory, Dennis. That was, yeah. I remember that, yeah.
Yeah. Well, he said, I think in his autobiography, he says that they then moved to his room, drank all of that too. And then there was shaving foam involved and all sorts. It really did get quite messy.
Again, I've got to be careful what I say, but I think if you take it that alcohol played a fair part in a lot of the stuff that was going on. I mean, no naughtiness in terms of throwing televisions out of windows or anything like that, but a lot of bars in a lot of towns around the world and a lot of very funny stuff that happened as a result, probably that I shouldn't go into.
And a lot of relationships formed as well. You mentioned John Weller, Paul's dad, Paul's manager. We should also mention Anne Weller as well, and Nikki, actually. The Weller family was such an important part of the mix for the Jam, the Style Council solo, wasn't it? But it'd be lovely to understand about those relationships and how important they were to this, right from the Jam, right the way through to Paul's solo career.
John Weller is probably one of the most important people in my life. I absolutely loved him, I mean, John and I couldn't have been more opposite, I suppose. I mean, I'm the ex-public school university chap with the little briefcase and the jacket and everything else. And John was like a sort of a lovely mixture of Del Boy and Ronnie Barker in Open All Hours, Probably more Ronnie Barker in Open All Hours, You wouldn't have thought that we'd have got on, but yeah, we really did. John didn't have any time for nonsense. Neither did Paul. It's like, absolutely, you don't fuck about, And really, if your name wasn't Weller, then you didn't really count as anything, if you see what I mean. You were very disposable, I'm probably wrong, but I always thought I was kind of like an honorary Weller in a funny sort of way, And I remember I would call up to speak to John at home. Anne would answer the phone and go, John, it's your only friend. And that was
brilliant.
So when John died and I sent some flowers, I mean, we'd fallen out before that. That's at the end of the story. And I put, from your only friend. And probably people looked at that and thought, you arrogant little tosser. But that was the joke.
Nice.
You have to say that John came into the music business knowing nothing about it. His qualifications to being a music manager was being Paul's dad. His sheer energy and determination to push and push and push and push and stand behind Paul, whatever happened, was just legendary. As a sort of a power behind the whole thing, that was the engine room. It was John in the background pushing every gig, turning up, absolutely every gig. And that's important for the story later, in fact. But it was the thing for John was getting out on the road, sampling the bars and the restaurants and stuff like that, looking after Paul. Every night, he'd be on this little flight case on the side of the stage, sitting there with his leather jacket and his white hair all swept back and everything. I mean, loved him, he's an absolutely smashing bloke, I have a huge debt of gratitude to not just Paul, but to John as well. Yeah. Because so much stuff that happened to me wouldn't have happened if it hadn't have been for their loyalty.
You mentioned about John being this kind of driving force. That definitely is the case when you read everything about the Style Council finishing and Paul getting back on the road as a solo artist. It felt like, from everything I read, it feels like it was John going to Paul, we need to get back on the road, son. We need to do this. We need to earn some money, essentially. What was your role in getting that working in terms of the solo career? Because some of those venues were back to the really small ones and you're working out from the ground again, aren't you?
Well, yeah, it was starting over again. Yeah, because the Style Council, I'm looking back on it. We were going off to places like Australia, which was hilarious, and Japan, which was also hilarious. And we were doing big shows over there and in different parts of Europe as well. So it wasn't just, a UK-centric thing. The Jam broke into some markets around the rest of the world. Then the Style Council broke into some of the same markets, but also other ones, and previous ones that were big didn't do so well. So it was always this thing of pushing into the new areas. So when Paul started, it was kind of like history repeating itself. And you think, well, that really is it, because, you get lucky and you have the Jam and then the Style Council. But it can't happen again. Nobody who has three different careers as
I can't think. Yeah, you're right. I can't think of any. Yeah.
It was a very strange time. I don't have as much memory of that as other stuff. I remember Paul inviting me down to the studio to hear the new album. And Paul could be an intimidating fucker. He'd sit right next to you and to make sure you're paying attention to every single song and then go, right, what do you think? Don't hold back to say exactly what's on it. And it's like, bloody hell. And you try to think of anything. I'm not a music critic. I don't know. It sounded very nice.
Well, it's also the fact that every creative asks for feedback, right? But then at the same time, none of them want to hear feedback.
It's that, you're right. But luckily it was really good. But I couldn't sit there. Again, I'm amazed. Maybe there are people out there who will hear a piece of music and think, yeah, that's going to be huge. I never could. I couldn't listen to Paul's new stuff and go, yeah, that's going to be huge, any more than, John used to, back in the days of the Jam, would come around with a little cassette and put it into our office stereo to play me the new single. And each one seemed to get more and more unpalatable to the point where he came in with one that I just thought, well, this has just gone too far. There's no way this is going to happen. How can you have a song that goes eat and rifles, and I thought, oh, plumb. And of course,
it's really interesting because this is 91, 92, and the first Paul Weller back on top of the pops was Aho, 1992. And I watched it the other day, and when you look at the charts at the time, everything else was, ironically, house music, given the Style Council's demise a few years before. Ironically, it's all that music. And even then, it seems to, what Paul was doing seems to stick out as something different. So you're right. It's not like you could kind of go, well, this is going to be a massive chart success. Nobody at that point could go, Wildwood and Stanley Road and Paul was going to be back on top. But again, it happened really quickly, didn't it? Within 3, 4, 5 years, you're playing Hyde Park, for Christ's sake.
Again, I'm not any kind of rock and roll historian. And you got to remember that for me, I was just sitting in my office doing my thing and booking shows, and trying to make sure I didn't get the dates wrong or something. But the biggie that happened in the 90s was the whole Britpop thing and Blur and Oasis. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall it, when Oasis took off, they and several other bands started to quote Paul as being their inspiration. So it's almost like people are giving each other a leg up, So, and then that whole Britpop thing happened, which kind of tied in with what Paul was doing. It was very sort of Beatlesy in a funny sort of way, wasn't it? And yeah, suddenly again, we're catapulted into the into the limelight, you know.
And at that point, playing bigger venues than he's ever played. I know they've done like Glastonbury Festival and things like that before, but some of the venues that you're having to book, again, it seems like you're having to think on your feet in terms of where to put him, but it kind of climbs really quickly to those bigger venues, doesn't it?
Yeah, it did. I mean, if you think about it, each time we sort of, with the Jam with the Style Council and with Paul's thing, we kind of started at the bottom again and wound his... there.
You're part of the mix, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
It was that. So again, starting off cautiously, and then suddenly again, within a couple of years, you're back there again. I think a lot of the venues we were playing were the same, because I don't think even in the 90s you had some of the arenas were appearing, but I don't think there were that many. So again, we were down to Bridlington Spas and Blackpool Tower Ballroom, and not the Equestrian Centre in Braintree, I'm pleased to say. I don't think we had to do that.
There were a few things at that time. There was like Finsbury Park suddenly became like a venue, didn't it? And I think Paul did there, and even probably, this was probably late 90s, but like things like Crystal Palace and stuff,
the Crystal Palace in the Old Bowl with the lake in front of it. Yeah. That was really nice. And we did the Phoenix Festival where Vince Power put on. And that was just a little side note. I'm watching the show from the mixer desk, and right behind the stage, there was Jupiter shining immediately over the stage at the moment that comet Schumacher-Levy was smacking into it. So it was I was kind of pissed off I wasn't somewhere else watching it with a telescope. There you go.
And so throughout that period, and you're there right through to Studio 150, what would highlights be from your point of view in terms of Paul's solo career, whether it's the music or like you say, booking the venues, seeing this rise again?
To be honest, it's more of the same. I mean, the insanity carried on exactly the same. I mean, it was the same crew. You got John and Paul and Kenny and all that sort of crowd, and all the stuff is going on, See, I always remember the bits that go wrong. If you've noticed that, it's always...
You're right. Yes.
One of my fondest memories was the V Festival, and I think it was in their second year that Stuart Compass and Dennis Desmond had put this V Festival thing together. They booked Paul, and it was like a sort of co-headlining thing, I think, with Richard Ashcroft, who'd just come out of the Verve and what have you. Big old festival, loads and thousands of people out there and stuff. And Paul went on and did a blistering set. I mean, it was, really, really classic stuff. And then right at the end of it, they were running out of time because there was a time slot you have to play in. And after that, you've got to have the next act on. So you've got Richard Ashcroft's people sort of jumping up and down, looking at their watches and what have you, At which point, Paul decides to invite Noel Gallagher up to appear, right? So Noel walks out there and the crowd go, well, hooray, But in the meantime, on the side of the stage, there's this massive ruckus going on because Richard Ashcroft's people do not want this to happen. They want Paul off. So Paul starts to either introduce Noel or something like that, and then this stage manager comes rushing on with his headphones on and everything, blah, 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 in Paul's ear, and basically pulls them off the stage. So then you've got this spectacle of Paul and Noel raising their guitars aloft like hooray and marching off the stage again. Noel not having played a note, not having unceremoniously ejected from the stage. And then coming down the ramp back towards the dressing rooms again, Noel was asking Paul, so what was the problem there? And he said, well, we're overrunning. There would have been a penalty, like the promoters would have had to pay extra money if they overran their curfew. And Noel came out with this classic line. He was dead serious. He said, well, I've got my credit card. Have you got yours? It's like, oh, okay. Whatever it is, we'll pay it. But anyway, didn't happen. That was a lovely moment.
So never got to play a note.
No, it's that sort of defiance. Again, in my experience, anybody who ever doubts whether an artist that they follow is what they seem to be in the public eye, as far as Paul Weller's concerned, it's like, it's what it says on the tin. Paul is exactly that, no nonsense, like fierce principles and absolute determination. Cases, for example, with the Style Council, we were playing a gig in Japan in Osaka. I'm going to keep this reasonably short, but in Japan at the time, the security barrier was a rope with a bloke on one end and another bloke on the other end, and the Japanese audience did not cross it, right? And you couldn't even get them to stand up. They'd probably stay seated, clap very politely and stuff like this. So Style Council were playing this blistering show, in this concert hall, which was on a rake. And you could see the audience was standing up. And the promoter was saying to me, this is getting a bit dangerous. We need to try to get them calmed down because they could just go at any minute. It's like when they reach a certain point, then suddenly it goes into an avalanche. So somebody went on stage and said to Paul, look, watch it because they're getting a bit overexcited. Paul came out with his classic line of, when I see panic, I'll panic. 5 minutes later, the entire audience, it was like a avalanche of humanity just poured onto the stage. Seriously, just wallop like this. Suddenly we're up to our arse. They're trying to play and all the audience are running around frantically backstage everywhere on the stage, completely off their trolleys. And it was evacuation time. So it was rush out the back door, pile everybody quickly onto a coach and took off down the street with half the audience chasing the coach down the road, laughing like idiots. Promoter got banned from playing in Osaka ever again. And that's what you're dealing with. It's not something that anybody else should ever go, oh, well, he did that. We should do that. It's not a good idea, but we did and we got away with it. But
It's amazing when you think about it. So the time of release of this podcast, the band have literally just gone into Black Barn. They're in rehearsals right now for the next tour, the next UK tour. It's incredible to think here we are 45 years on from signing that first record deal with Polydor, those first Cowbell live dates that we talked about with the Jam, still performing live, still smashing it, still performing new material as well to the public.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? It's phenomenal,
Yeah.
I never quite got why the rest of the world never really saw that. It's funny because looking back through some of the stuff that we did with for Paul's solo stuff, and it was all still pretty UK-centric. I mean, we did some forays into Europe, played some more festivals, I think, than we'd probably played before. But, it was kind of token, and it wasn't that big. It was kind of 1,000 to 2,000 capacity type things that we were doing in our own right, And yet in England, in Britain, then it had all gone through the roof. I suppose, when you say Britpop, and you've got to bring that in there somewhere because it definitely was a factor. The clue is in the name, I guess, it's Brit. But I was also realizing that, and I'd never thought about this before, but in fact, different phases of Paul's career also tied in with what I was doing at the time, because if the Jam was Cowbell time, which we talked about, and then the Style Council in the 80s was pretty well after I managed to end up as one of the people co-running the place to get it turned into World Service, which I thought was a smarter name. It's probably equally stupid. I remember John didn't like it very much, World Service, what's that, And then, of course, with Paul's solo stuff, it was the Mighty Primary, where we'd formed this sort of, at the time, mega agency. And with computers, we actually had computers, I don't
know how I was talking to Kenny Wheeler. I got lucky enough to get invited over to his place a couple of months back. And I had it, for some reason, you kind of, and Tracy Young was saying this as well, you kind of transport how we do things now back to those days. So in my head, everything was all emails and it's like, no, of course not. There weren't even mobile phones. How you did this with Post-it notes and whatever, I don't know.
We didn't have Post-it notes. That was
well, that would have been that was the future.
I mean, if you take it that when we started, then we had telex machine. So you had a telex operator in Cowbell and you'd have phones. So as an agent, you'd learn to speed dial, to really twist that dial really quickly and to look busy on the phone all the time, And then everything you sent out was typed up by somebody and sent out as a letter. If it wasn't on a telex, And it was really only late 80s, I think, that Chris Parry persuaded me to get a fax machine. And I pointed out, you're the only person I know who's got one. So... So when Primary started in 1990, and that tied in, as I said, with Paul doing his solo stuff, we were very high-tech, having this sort of dumb terminals on everyone's desks and databases and stuff like that. Hadn't got a clue how to use them, but they looked great.
I mean, and a really important roster, again, there for you in terms of, and the lineup on that agency was huge as well, wasn't it?
Again, this is a little bit sort of agent history. Agency up to that point had been very boutique-y, so the rosters were quite small. And that's a longer story to do with me and my relationship with Chrysalis and the fact that they were going public. And I didn't particularly think that rock and roll belonged in a PLC. And there's all sorts of stuff that probably I shouldn't talk about around that time, but it ended up with us merging World Service with another agency called Station Agency, which was run by a chap called Steve Hedges, who, were handling Simple Minds and Simply Red and Genesis and Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel and Depeche Mode and what have you. We were quite advanced, I suppose, because we pulled in what we called a dance department, a guy who had some DJs and stuff. So he'd sit there doing whatever he did, which was a mystery to the rest of us with the dance stuff, And that was the start of Primary, which is still going and doing really well. I actually resigned as being the managing director, oddly enough, just after everything had finished with Paul and John. And it's strange because I always told them that the day that fell apart, I would pack it in. And I did. Although, luckily enough for me, certain people like Peter Gabriel and The Cure, I've continued to work with on a sort of consultancy basis. So, and that was back in 2005, something like that, I guess,
Yeah, so right up to Studio 150. And you mentioned earlier on that kind of relationship coming to an end, or was it a falling out? How did that finish?
Oh, blimey. That's the sad bit. Yeah, we'll deal with the sad bit and then we'll talk about some funnier stuff, right? But
go on.
So I think the background to that was that I mentioned, this is tricky. I mentioned before John's dedication to Paul and wanting to be on all the shows and sit on his flight case and count his cash and all that sort of stuff and play poker. You could be in the most beautiful part of the world with fantastic scenery or something. You'd find John downstairs with Kenny playing poker and basically robbing all the per diems off the crew before he could even pay them.
Yeah, Kenny mentioned that, yeah.
At the end of the tour, they'd all end up owing him money, But that was very much the game for John. And I think it's fair to say that flying was never very popular with any of the incarnations of the Weller whatever. We had several comic cuts trying to, so you're on tour in Australia with the Style Council. Somehow they managed to get themselves by plane down to Australia, although apparently arriving with blankets over their heads and stuff and really not wanting to see any of it, didn't like it. But then we had to go from Melbourne to Sydney, and I tried to explain that the plane would be the same sort of plane. It wasn't going to be like the what do they call it? Is it the Bush Doctor or what? You know what I mean? Like some sort of with goggles and stuff like that. It was going to be a 747 and the same plane they'd been flying down in. But no, they wouldn't have it, so they insisted on getting a train. So the promoter arranged 3 special Pullman carriages for us on this train that wound its way through the outback from Melbourne to Sydney. And there is nothing to look at, by the way, for like 19 hours or something. We had a sort of an old 60s or whatever Pullman type thing with nice big armchairs in it and stuff. And then there was, in between, there was a carriage that was devoted to be like a jamming space. So they'd arranged a little drum kit and tambourines and maracas and some guitars and stuff like that. It was like something out of Hard Day's Night,
Yeah.
The Beatles are in the baggage carriage or something like that. And so we sat on this bloody train for about 19 hours watching nothing, going past by the windows, sitting there playing appallingly badly in this special carriage, And so, the flying wasn't very good. And as John was getting older, his liking of the idea of jumping on planes to go off and do foreign shows, we kind of ended up in a situation, I think it's unfair to say, where the forays outside of the UK were anywhere that you could get to in a coach without too many hours on a coach, getting a lot into Northern Europe. So there wasn't the same sort of push there, I guess. I think around that time, I think it was in the early 2000s, and I don't know if you got this thing, when Paul started doing his solo acoustic stuff.
Days of Speed, which I loved, actually. I thought those shows, they were fabulous.
Yeah, they really were. And it was a blistering idea because it meant that you could go off and play in similar sort of capacities to what we've been doing, which, as I said, weren't huge in Europe, 1,000, 2,000 or something, just with Paul and a guitar, much smaller crew, no band or anything else. And those were really stonking shows, And it sounds weird. It's a guy with an acoustic guitar, but they were really powerful, you know.
It's interesting you say that, actually, because Kenny, as I was about to leave Kenny Wheeler's house, this was not recorded on the podcast because I packed all my gear up. But he said, do you know what? Thinking about it, one of my favourite tours was the Days of Speed tour. And when I asked him why, he was saying because actually it was back to, you know, it was him, Paul, John, and it was such a tight, small crew. And he was like, I loved that. It was my mates and we were just having a laugh, yeah.
It was. And yet it was a really good way to tour. I mean, I think we're talking about the sad bit about how the whole thing kind of ground to a halt with me. And this is something I've got to be very careful how I talk about it. But look, the reality is, as we all know, it wasn't that much later that John died. And it became very clear to me that he wasn't well. It got to the point where, oh, God, this is horrible. But the memory was starting to go. So the trouble was, my job as an agent was to represent the artist for live shows, build up a relationship with the promoters and keep pushing and trying to plan and manipulate and what have you, Paul into the very best situations. The problem I was finding was that John would forget the stuff that we'd agreed to do. And so it came to the point where, you know, we had email and stuff like that by then, but none of that was stuff that was being used. So I would be sending John a weekly letter, an actual sort of letter called John's Mailbag. That's right, a little logo for it and everything, John's Mailbag, and I'd write down all the stuff that we'd agreed. But sadly, a lot of it didn't get read either. So we hit a point where John clearly wasn't very well, where stuff that we'd agreed was being forgotten about and denied. There was a festival in Spain, Benicassim Festival, that Paul was due to play. And John had no recollection of having agreed to it and got quite angry about it. You know, I think also we had a meeting with myself and John and Paul and a guy from the record company. Sorry, guy from the record company, but I can't remember who you were. There you go. In our meeting room at the agency. And we were talking about, you know, which way forward for Paul internationally. And I ventured the idea, well, yeah, but, you know, if we did the solo acoustic shows, that would make it would be very flexible. We could, you know, go further out into the world and pop over to here and do this and pop over there. And I think it was the word popping over that wound John up, because before I knew it, he'd got up and walked out of the meeting, very upset. And with me following him to the lift going, you okay, mate? You know, and after that, it kind of went downhill. And the problem was I was trying to talk to Paul about it, but John didn't like the idea of, he felt that you were going over his head if you went and spoke to Paul directly. So that didn't work. Eventually, I had to actually down tools and stop, because I couldn't do my job and commit promoters to lots and lots of money booking halls and doing advertising campaigns and stuff like that if there was a very strong chance that the show wasn't going to happen. And it was like that. Obviously, after that whole relationship came to an end, which was incredibly sad. And I did pack in my job as the MD of Primary. And then it was after that, it was when John died. And, you know, I miss him so much. I still have dreams about him, you know. I mean, really, I've said before, but really important figure in my life. And I loved him to bits. Yeah, it's really very, very sad. But there you go. You know, we had nearly 3 decades and 3 different careers. So I'm not complaining. You know?
And that love for John comes through on this chat that we've had. That definitely comes across in the conversation. You mentioned some fun stories as well. How rock and roll did it get? You read about other bands, people living in the chaos on tour and liking that lifestyle and stuff. Was it mainly the booze that was the thing and people kind of, you know, just staying up all hours?
It's funny because, you know, Rick's comment about it being a well-oiled machine, and it was weird because when you looked at the characters that were involved in it, you'd think you couldn't organise a piss up in a brewery.
Yeah.
It was like the SAS team going into different countries and just putting these shows together, and it would just happen. And you think, I have no idea how this is happening, because it's not like the top flight music business people that you get with the Pink Floyd tours and the whatever.
Because it feels like so many of you had to be making up as you went along, because there's that experience isn't there, certainly from the very early days. Like you say, John had no background in music management at all, and Kenny likewise. It's, you know, so you're just winging it to a certain extent, are you?
Yes, I suppose so. It really was kind of John and me sitting back and trying to work out what to do next, with him saying, we could slip a couple of gigs in there, mate, couldn't we? And how about this summer? We could do that. And how about we pop off and do this festival or what have you? So it was pushing all the time, just gig, with Paul having this, like I said before, this work ethic just to sort of do it, just have it, Paul, and the expression having it large, that's Paul. Does not fuck about. He would just go for a broke, Oh, God, I can't tell you. I mean, I can't.
You literally can't tell.
Yeah. I literally can't tell you the images that are going through my mind at the moment. But no, you'd have to imagine. And yet, gigs come around, everybody's there, nobody's falling over. It's really brilliant shows, really intense, and it worked. I do remember one occasion of being on a show in Germany. Oh, God, sorry. You see, I say that, and then suddenly all these other things come back to me. But I remember John was a great one for White Russians, right? Which I'm not even sure what the hell it is, but it's a drink with cream and alcohol in it. I think it's vodka.
It sounds revolting, yeah.
So he was big on White Russians. And if you went off into a bar, sorry, I just thought about our Beano trip to Eastbourne, which was a whole other story. Anyway, if you made the mistake of going into a bar with any of the Weller crew, then you probably were stuck there. And they might as well have held you down and put a funnel in your mouth and poured White Russians down it. I mean, you had no choice. Otherwise, it was, get it down, you fucking lightweight. It was that. So it was, okay. So I'm in this bar with John, and everyone's been reasonably well behaved, but really knocking it back. And the rest of, gradually, everybody else had left the bar. Paul had gone. Nicky had gone. I think Kenny had given up and gone as well even. And normally he was the last man standing to look after Paul. There's just me and John in the bar. He'd been serving me White Russians all night. And what he didn't know is I'd literally been tipping them into this plant pot that was next to me on the bar when he wasn't looking, right? So then, you're empty. I'll fill it up again, So I was stone cold sober. Everybody else was completely gone. John had to get off his stool, so I had to sort of help him off his stool. And we actually ended up walking across the hotel lobby with John's arm wrapped around my neck, sort of supporting him, trying to look as if we're just being pally in case there were any CCTV cameras watching us. Got him up to the corridor where his room was in time to see another member of the Weller family, who I won't mention, flat on the person's back with just the head and torso sticking out of their bedroom door into the corridor and being inched by an invisible force back into the room. As I come by with John draped round my shoulder, Paul has got this person's ankles and he's pulling them into the room. And as I go past, he goes, "What a fucking family." At which point we tried to put John on his bed, and he sort of bounced straight up again, ready to start fighting anybody who'd just thrown him into his bed. It's like, okay, just go to sleep, mate. And that was kind of like a typical, don't ever go into a bar with a Weller. It's
live music right now seems to be in a weird kind of situation because Brexit, the impacts of COVID. It seems like a really challenging time for people who are working in the live music industry right now.
Yeah, the last couple of years have been a total nightmare. Brexit was a total bloody nightmare as well. And then with the COVID thing, obviously there's been a lot of casualties. We've lost a lot of, I don't mean who died with COVID, although obviously we've had that, but a lot of people who were reliant on the business carrying on for their income. So road crew, all the production companies, the trucking companies, it's not just about the artists, it's about that massive pyramid of support operations, the caterers, and the venues, huge pile of people that the artist that's invisible, that the artist sits on top of, but take away any of them and none of it could happen. We've lost so many people and, people are sort of forgetting what their job was. It's like a lot of people I've spoken to suddenly having to work again, thinking, hang on, how do I do this? How do you run a catering company? How do you operate a venue? That's not easy. There's a lot of people involved in running a venue that it's a really sort of hardened, finely honed team of people. And, you get out of the groove. So that's been really tough. Perversely enough, for me personally, I've spent the last year preparing a Cure tour that's been announced now around Europe. And it's the biggest tour I've ever done. I think it's about 550,000 people or something on
Wow.
45 dates, and a lot of them are sold out already, all within a couple of weeks. So, but I know that, for other people that haven't been so lucky, I mean, The Cure have this phenomenal fan base to build on. And for other people, certainly people, I think, who are not quite as established, the attempts to tour, the cancellations, the postponements, the reluctance from the public to commit money to a show they're not sure it's going to happen or not, has really made a dent. And the festivals, because the festivals have become the main meat and drink of the live business. But, a couple of years without the festivals, still having their bills to pay and their teams to keep on, it's been savage. But hopefully, crossing fingers, we're coming to the end of it and we can start to have some fun again,
Well, fingers crossed. So, where I can, I've been over the past year getting back into those gigs again. And there's something so special about live music, as much as getting a new album and buying that on release day, being in with a crowd, that social aspect of enjoying the music that you love is such a special thing, isn't it?
It is from the audience's point of view, although honestly, I think I still prefer the days when you go into a gig with sticky carpets from all the beer that had been spilt and sweat dripping off the ceiling and full of smoke. And now you go into these immaculate, modern, American-built arenas and you can't smoke and the beer's warm and paper cups. You know what I mean? I don't think it's as much fun. And certainly the business isn't anything like as much fun as now that it's become very corporate, so much emphasis on the share value or what CEOs move from what conglomeration to another corporation and all this kind of stuff. When we started and we're talking about the days of the Jam, and we didn't even know where places were in Europe, let alone who to call up, and just winging it as we went along, with the Jam heading off to Scandinavia with like a year's supply of baked beans because I didn't know what the food was going to be like then, and now it's very kind of, it's even more well-oiled than it ever was, but it's not quite as exciting.
Martin, it's been so fabulous spending time with you for this podcast. I have two final questions before you go. The first one, you're allowed one Paul Weller song for the rest of your life.
It can be the Jam, the Style Council, or solo. Now, I should say, people, what happened then? Whilst I was asking that question, Martin paused for a moment to light a cigarette and the look of panic in his eyes. But you're allowed one song from Weller. What are you going to go with?
That's completely unfair. I mean, why don't you pick a group that's had no hits?
That'd be easier. One hit wonder. Terence Trent D'Arby,
Wildwood.
Wildwood. Why that song?
Because I can play it on the guitar and because Paul showed me the chords.
Amazing.
Nobody knows what those chords are. I know what they are.
That's so good. I love it. Final question. So the purpose of this podcast, Martin, is not least to talk to amazing people like yourself who've had these fabulous careers, these amazing connections with Paul and the Weller crew and all that. But it's for me to be able to interview Paul Weller, the interview I never managed to get in my radio career. If it happens, what should I ask him?
Can we have a pause while lighting 3 other cigarettes? All right. So one thing, it's funny, isn't it? Because I don't claim that Paul is any kind of great seer or philosopher or what have you, right? But once on a coach, I'm just pulling this at random because you've asked me and you're interviewing me, so I've got to think of something to say, haven't I, right?
Go on.
And we were sitting on a coach once and we were just getting a bit philosophical, and he said to me, for me, it's all about greatness. And it stuck in my brain. And I did actually reply at the time, well, it's dead easy for you to try to aspire to greatness because you're bloody Paul Weller. But, somebody who's stacking shelves in a supermarket doesn't have quite the same opportunity to hit greatness. But it did stick with me. So I suppose my question is that what it's still about? Not a bad answer, is it? Hey, you've got to hand it to me. That was pretty good.
That was a great answer, I have to say. And it's one of those things where you wonder how much of it is God-given talent, if such a thing exists, versus that work ethic thing that you talked about earlier, right?
Yes, but I mean, then anybody who just wanted to work hard enough could do the same thing. And what's missing there is the talent. It's something that I don't know where that comes from. I don't know whether it's something that's inevitable. I don't know whether if things had been different, whether Paul would have ended up doing something else for a living, still being capable of coming out with those amazing tunes. I don't know. It's the ability to do that. And that's something which comes from God knows where,
Martin, this has been great. I've loved every second of this, man. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been good fun, Dan. Thank you very much. It wasn't anything like as painful as I thought it was going to be.
You're welcome.
Very nice chatting to you.
My thanks once again to Martin Hopewell. Some really, really special memories in that one. And so nice to hear about all the connections, the love for John and Paul, actually all of the Wellers, and the Jam, the Style Council, and the first 14, 15 years of the solo career as well. So special. Thanks so much, Martin. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please share on your social media channels and don't forget to give us a follow on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'd love it if you could give us a 5-star review too. It really does help us to find new listeners to the show. Now, you can find me on social media as well. Get in touch on Twitter @WellerFanPod or on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for Paul Weller Fan Podcast. I also have a website, so you can find more information about the podcast there. I do show notes and blogs and special features as well. Just go to paulwellerfanpodcast.com. Now, next up on the podcast, as Paul and the current band lineup start rehearsals for the upcoming tour, we are joined by one of the band members. How's that for a little teaser for you? You're going to love this one, honestly. Make sure you subscribe to get it first. Up next on the podcast, I cannot wait to share this one with you. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.